Welcome to Face the Nation Web Extra, more with our presidential books panel. Doris Kearns Goodwin is the author of Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream. Karl Rove is the author of The Triumph of William McKinley. Jon Meacham's new book is Destiny and Power, The American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush. And Edward Larson is the author of The Return of George Washington, Uniting the States, 1783 to 1789. Welcome back, all of you. Jon, I want to start with you, but it's a question I'll ask to all of you, which is, history often gets these presidents wrong in the first crack. Journalists, I've heard, sometimes do that too.
I've read that.
So you've all spent a lot of time with these people in your heads. What's the big thing that people got wrong about George Herbert Walker Bush?
I think two things. One is that there was no domestic record, and the other was that he had no political instincts. He was a curiously unpolitical president. When you look back now, the perspective of a quarter century, you have the Americans with Disabilities Act, you have the Clean Air Act, which is still functionally our environmental policy, and the 1990 budget deal, which imposed budgetary spending controls that Bill Clinton will tell you at length, which is redundant, that helped set the terms of prosperity for the 1990s. So it's a pretty good domestic record. The other is, interestingly, in his diary, there are a couple of moments where he was ahead of the pundits, he was ahead of his own staff. He knew instantly. The first time Michael Dukakis' name appears in the diary, he says, this will be easy to put into a liberal versus conservative frame. He didn't need focus groups. He didn't need Lee Atwater to come tell him that. He just knew it. And so I think the other was right after the Gulf War, he knew his 89%, 90% approval ratings were very soft. He said the election will be about the economy. It's not going to be about the war.
Right. Ed, what do they get wrong about Washington?
Well, first, they get it mostly right in the sense that Washington, in every poll ever taken, is always in the top 3 American presidents. That's where I think he belongs. But what they get wrong is that they tend to view him as wooden, and they tend to view him as not a politician. And Washington was was not wooden at all, and he was a very good retail politician in the sense that he was very collegial. He loved to talk. He was a great conversationalist. He'd tell stories. He's a great storyteller. Men liked him, women liked him. He loved to dance. He danced with every woman whenever there was a ball. He related to other people. He could talk. He could build consensus. He was a natural politician. And you know, we tend to think of generals not being presidential because we think of Grant and the image of Grant or other presidents. But he was like Eisenhower. He was first a political general. He had been a politician before he became president. He'd worked his way up in the House of Burgesses in Virginia, and then he got himself elected to the First Continental Congress, which was quite a feat since he wasn't from one of the first families of Virginia. Then beyond that, during the war, he had to keep all the state militias in play, work with the French, keep them in play. So in that sense, he had to keep the army working in a time when we were being defeated after defeated by the British. And he did that politically the same way Eisenhower kept everyone working together in D-Day. So in that sense, he was a politician his whole life, and he continued that in building the coalition that led to ratification of the Constitution, and then as president, keeping the parties working together to unite the states and create a greater union. So that sense of him being a hands-on retail politician, we don't see that because we tend to have that image that's on the $1 bill, this wooden man.
Karl, I want to ask you a slight variation on this, which is that in the election of 1896, it's William Jennings Bryan that everybody knows about from that. Why is that, and is that a part of what people get wrong about McKinley?
Well, it's funny. We talk about these 5 great realigning elections in American history: 1800 with Jefferson, 1828 with Jackson, 1860 with Lincoln, 1932 with FDR. But the one that we talk about only in terms of the loser, William Jennings Bryan, or the man who succeeds the winner, Theodore Roosevelt, is the election of 1896. And it's unfair because the deeper you get into this, the more remarkable a human being McKinley is. And in fact, we think of him as the creation of Marcus Alonzo Hanna, and that's because of William Randolph Hearst, who looked at the personality and character of McKinley and said, this is a courageous individual, a man of great character. We make a mistake if we attack him. Go after the ironmonger and coal magnate from Cleveland, depict him always as a fat man with a suit made up of dollar bills, and downplay McKinley, make him a little puppet. But if you look underneath the surface, the man who is making the key decisions, 3 big key decisions, 1895 Hannah arrives back from New York, says we can cut a deal with the bosses, spread the patronage around, make Platt the Secretary of Treasury, and you can be president. And McKinley says, I want to go to the White House unmortgaged. We'll do it alone. And then the other, I'm going to stay in Canton, Ohio, and engage in the front porch campaign. He's saying that, and everybody else is saying something different. And then the decision to take on Bryan on the issue of currency, it's McKinley who awakens to the fact he needs to do it. And he is an unbelievable picker of talent. And the man who actually runs the 1896 campaign is not Marcus Alonzo Hanna, who's the fundraiser and good friend of the candidate. It is a young man who McKinley meets in 1894 who's 28 years old, and McKinley, first of all, puts him in charge of his primary campaign in the most brutal contest, Illinois, which one of McKinley's advisors said is the Gettysburg of the contest. The young man defeats the Chicago Republican machine led by the blonde boss, and McKinley then says, I want you to run my campaign. And he runs the campaign, and he's 30 years old, turns 31 just before the election. He later becomes the comptroller of the currency at the age of 32, first director of the Bureau of the Budget under Warren G. Harding, vice president of the United States, ambassador to Great Britain, first head of the Reconstruction Corporation, and the fourth American to win the Nobel Peace Prize. But when McKinley picks him out of the crowd, he's a 28-year-old attorney in Lincoln, Nebraska, who practices law in the same little office building with, and is a member of the men's club, men's debate and reading club, the round table with William Jennings Bryan, Charles G. Dawes. And McKinley is an incredible picker.
You did that great.
It was good, and there's no teleprompter over my shoulder.
I kept waiting for Charles Dawes' name.
So Doris, for you, what either with LBJ or FDR, I mean, what's a big mistake that your work kind of showed when you were working?
I'm not sure if I showed it, but I think history is now reevaluating as we speak and breathe LBJ at 50 years. I mean, when I worked for him and helped him on his memoir, he was so sad. I mean, he thought then that his legacy would be cut in two forever by the war in Vietnam. And there was a depression that had settled over him. And there was no way of knowing that it was true that for decades that would be the most important thing people thought about LBJ was the war in Vietnam. But what's been so good to see that as the 50th anniversary has come, not only of voting rights and civil rights, but of Medicare and aid to education, and an extraordinary ability to deal with Congress that no president had even come close to, even probably FDR. He's now getting his rightful place back in history. And I only wish he'd been alive to see it, because he did things that have, as I said before, stood the test of time. His ambition, we think of him as somebody who wanted power. He did. He wanted power from the time he was 4 years old. But eventually, he always said, I want power because you have to do something when you're president. Power has a purpose. I don't want it just to strut around. And I think we too often saw him as a man consumed by power, but the power was for purpose. And those purposes have been as good in expanding social justice and economic opportunity as any other president we've had since FDR.
I want to pick up on this idea of ambition, because when you write about LBJ, when he doesn't have power, he's a ghost of a dissipated person, and that balance between needing the personal, lights, being in there doing things, and yet obviously George Washington, the whole point was your personal ambition shouldn't leap over your virtue. Jon, let's start with you. There are a couple of passages I can remember too where George Herbert Walker Bush is out of power for the moment, and he's saying, I don't want to sit around and listen to my friends tell me about their daughters pledging pie fire, and then another time it's Tridelt.
Right, Tridelt,
He's almost vibrating to get back in the game. But yet this is a person who's sublimated his own career repeatedly at various times.
Yeah. You're exactly right. Yeah, he said when he went back to Houston in 1977 after finishing up as director of the CIA, he said he didn't want to get into that late Houston dinner social thing, 3 or 4 martinis, and he didn't even want to know who's banging old Joe's wife, as only George Herbert Walker Bush could put it. He was ferociously ambitious. I think he got it from his mother, who once broke her wrist playing a tennis match, but finished it and won. And he was shaped by, as many of our people we write about are shaped by a duty to serve and a drive to win. And my view is that if you should ultimately be judged on what you do once you have power, less on what you do to win power in an imperfect world. If you're looking for a perfect world where you have a perfect candidate who does everything, then you're looking in the wrong place.
I think the perfect example of somebody who had a trouble out of power was Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, his daughter Alice Roosevelt said of him, he so wanted to be in the center stage everywhere he went that he wanted to be the baby at the baptism and the bride at the wedding and the corpse at the funeral. And then not being able to be out of power, he then comes back and runs against his good friend Taft and destroys the Republican chances of winning and hurts the progressive cause that he loved. So this very thing that gave him strength, that everybody loved this guy in the center fighting, gave the weakness at the other end.
I love what Madison writes about Washington. Washington is no longer generally goes back, and Madison says a mind like his cannot bear a vacancy. He's got to be doing something.
That's the way he was. And what John was saying about Bush in so many ways applies to Washington. He was a tremendously ambitious man. He was an ambition from the time he was born as the first child of the second wife of a plantation owner who was never going to inherit the plantation and had to work for a living. And so he started working for other people, for Fairfields, developing his own career, as it were. But what his ambition was never for power and never for money, even though he acquired great power and acquired great wealth in a very fortuitous marriage. And the fact that his older brothers died and he did inherit the plantation. But what he always wanted to do, even when he was young, he'd write about this. Back when he was young, he said, I want to have fame. My goal is to have fame. But as it matured, it was, I want to leave a legacy. I want to make a difference in this life and be remembered. Now, he was a child of the Enlightenment. And for him, that was create a government of the people. That was a phrase he used often, government of the people. Lincoln later added a few phrases to it, but Washington was always government of the people. There weren't any of those in the world. We had dictatorships, we had monarchies, we had theocracies. He believed in government of the people and to get that to work. And that would be his legacy, create something new under the sun. And he wanted to leave that legacy, first as a general in the Revolution, and then after the Revolution, when it looked like it was all falling apart, during the Confederation period, he was pulled back in to create a union that pulled things together that would make government of the people work. He said, you read his letters during that period, who but a Tory would believe what has happened to our country? We need to make this work. So that sense of driving ambition that kept him coming out of retirement and going back into public life is a person he shares with so many of our great presidents, so many of our great leaders.
Karl, McKinley could have gone two ways, gone with the bosses or the route you describe. What was it about him that knew not to play the game with the bosses and try this new gamble?
Well, he was a man of enormous integrity, and I think in a way he was sickened by the politics of the Gilded Age, and that's why I think he was such a great picker of talent. He had ambition. His wife returns from their honeymoon and confides in friends that my husband will be president. So he is consumed by ambition. But his object was to serve, and part of service was identifying the young talent. There's a young man in the campaign who steps forward. He's consumed by ambition. His political future is over. He's on the wrong side of his state party. The state party leader hates him, and he's ambitious, and he wants to get back to Washington. And so he backs the front runner, Thomas Brackett Reed, and when Reed loses, he's devastated, because he thinks little of McKinley. Writes his sister a letter and says, McKinley's a good man, but, quote, he is weak, and I worry about him in a moment of crisis for our country. And then shortly thereafter writes some of McKinley's closest friends and says, we must do everything we can to elect McKinley. And when he's elected, you must be in the cabinet or the minister to France, and my ambitions, such as they are, must go by the wayside. And spends the next 5 months consumed by ambition, weaseling his way into the good graces of the campaign. Close friend of his, John Hay, writes, another friend of theirs, Henry Adams, and says, H&T have gone to Canton to bare their tummies and commit Harry-Carry in front of the major. McKinley invited me to join the spectacle, but I didn't want to join the mob on his lawn. But ambition has consumed Theodore Roosevelt, and he weasels his way into the good graces of McKinley. And at the end of the campaign, Roosevelt sponsors a former congressman and his wife from Cincinnati, Ohio, Bellamy and Marie Stoyer, go to McKinley and say, you need to give him a shot. You need to give him a shot at being the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And McKinley says, I will, but I do not trust your young man Roosevelt. He's too pugnacious, but gives him the shot. Ambition plays a necessary role in not only running for president, but in advancing yourself in politics. Without ambition in 1896, Theodore Roosevelt's future would have been impossible if he had not been ambitious enough to say, I must do everything I possibly can to ingratiate myself with a man that I really don't think much of. And yet he came to love McKinley. When McKinley is assassinated, there's this huge scene in the cemetery in Canton, Ohio. 16,000 people have marched into the cemetery. The school children of Nashville, Tennessee, John's hometown, have sent trainloads of sweet pea flowers. You have grizzled Union veterans pulling up these flowers, putting them on their lapels as they march into the Canton Cemetery to place the president's body in a receiving vault. The entire cabinet is there, many of them openly weeping. And Roosevelt is so overcome with emotion, he's standing to the side because he's afraid that if he's with the other members of the cabinet, he too will be overcome. And to allay the concerns of the country, he says, I will continue McKinley's cabinet and McKinley's policies.
And yet, on the other hand, to be fair to Teddy Roosevelt, he goes beyond, I think, where McKinley would have gone. He sees the rising gap between the rich and the poor.
Right.
He sees big corporations swallowing up small corporations. And he calls for something which is a square deal. So clear that people understood it. I don't care if the capitalist does a right job, I'll be for him. If he does wrong, I'm going after him. If the labor guy screws up, I'm going after him. But more importantly, he understands how to deal with the journalists, how to create a partnership, to create public sentiment that'll force a reluctant Republican Congress to pass the laws that had to be passed to undo the exploitation of the Industrial Revolution. And the conservation thing probably wouldn't have happened without him. Laws that antitrust things happened. I mean, there was a more aggressive spirit, I think, to taking on the social problems. So when your guy died and my guy got in there, they made a good combination.
McKinley was good with the press, but the way he dealt with them was he made them ambassadors or the Librarian of Congress.
Is this option still available? The last question, John, for you, which is, I was struck by the diaries.
Yeah.
Both President Bush and the First Lady. I guess just talk a little bit about those, the voice that he uses in those diaries. It's quite honest, and also I worry. I feel like we're never going to have a president who does that again, just for fear of subpoenas or for.
We damn near lost this one. Boyd and Gray, President Bush's counsel, will say he advised his client against it. So fortunately, the client ignored that advice. The White House diary of George H.W. Bush is an audio diary. He dictated once, twice, sometimes 3 times a week, often early in the morning, late at night. Air Force One, Marine One, Camp David. They are very candid, as you say. I think that the reason for it, the reason they resonate so, and the reason they are kind of un-Bushian. I mean, this is a man whose, again, mother said never use the first-person pronoun. His speechwriters used to just write, went to Texas, elected to Congress. It was easier than having him stumble over the great I am, as his mother called it. I think that he was confessional in these diaries because it was the only place he could be. He told me once, he said, no one wants to hear a president say, oh, woe is me. You're just damn lucky to be there. And so he would say things to himself that he could not say to anyone else. In fact, on a number of occasions, I would go to officials of the first Bush administration and say, this is what the president was thinking, and they would say, no, he wasn't. He never said that to me. Well, he didn't, but he said it to himself. Mrs. Bush kept a diary from 1948. She's still keeping it, and was very generously granted me access to it. It's highly perceptive, a remarkable document. The first time she met the Reagans, just seeing how charismatic and handsome they were, all the ups and downs of the political years. The 1980 convention, where Ronald Reagan almost put Gerald Ford on the ticket. Both Bushes have said to me since that if that had happened, neither one of them would have been president. So it's kind of, the diaries chart this kind of political adventure story.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going to happen 200 years from now. People will have so much more access to us in terms of they'll see us moving around, videos, emails maybe, but they won't have that intimate understanding that comes from diaries. I mean, all the people that I've studied, they've been, letters and diaries are the most treasured sources, and we're not going to have that same access anymore.
And I loved reading. Washington had this lovely way of writing in his letters that I hadn't associated with him until.
Well, that's another thing we misplace about Washington, because he wasn't a public speaker because of his teeth. I mean, his teeth were falling out all the time, so he couldn't enunciate. So he wasn't a speaker like some of the early leaders were. But he was a great writer. Remember, he loved to read. He loved plays. He loved going to plays. John Adams said about him he was the greatest political actor he'd ever seen because he was such a good political actor. Well, it was in his letters, and his letters there were so many of them because everyone admired him, and so he was writing to all the governors to try to pull this country together and all the political leaders throughout. And in those letters, we see what he was thinking. And then he built these tremendous relationships with his former lieutenants. So people like Lafayette would be the most famous, and he would write to these people, and you can see he bears his soul. So there's work in a way like President Bush's audio diaries, and so from reading Washington and his writings and his thoughts when he's writing to all these people and other people in France where he thinks he can write honestly to.
Think about
we
the
get to see
humility
him.
he shows. What that famous letter he writes on his way to Washington, where he wonders whether he has the capacities to really embark on this voyage and his reputation. I mean, where is that humility in our current candidates today?
And we see that in Washington so often in his private. Publicly, he knew he had to display an image. So as president, he had this dignified image. As general, he had to have a particular image. But when he was out of power during the period I covered between the two, he could be himself. And he had his thoughts. He had his deepest ideas. And he worried about whether he could live up to this role. But of course, he always did.
All right, I'm going to have to stop it there, although I would like to be here till dinner. But thanks all of you. This is a great pleasure for me, and thanks for sticking around.
Oh, it was great
Thanks, Jon.
fun.
Thank you.